On today's session, we weigh in on the takeaways and highlights from the World Economic Forum that took place in Davos earlier this year and the agenda preparation for the Conference of the Parties, also known as COP28, taking place in the United Arab Emirates in November and December of this year. Today I have with me Youmna Naufal, Director at Brunswick Group in Abu Dhabi, a geopolitical advisor and media specialist, among others. Hi Youmna, and thank you for joining us. I know that you have been attending the Davos Summit for the past few years, and we will dive into that shortly. Can you please start by telling us more about yourself and your role at Brunswick Group?
Sure, Nada. Thanks for having me today. Very excited to be here to talk about climate action and sustainability. As you correctly mentioned, I am a director at Brunswick Group based in the Abu Dhabi office, and I am a media specialist working in corporate comms, advising several high-profile clients across different industries, ranging from the financial to media, real estate, consumer, and also providing counsel to clients on geopolitical issues. And it just so happens I also co-manage Brunswick Global's relationship with the World Economic Forum, also known as WEF.
So we know that since 1971, and I want to talk a bit about Davos, of course, and the themes and the takeaways from your from the event earlier this year. We know that since 1971, world leaders have been coming together for 1 week in Davos to talk about what's to be done with the regional and global industry agendas. And now we are seeing more and more business leaders, civil society, prominent thinkers, and academic leaders as well, engaging to shape the global industry agenda. What can we learn from this year's annual meeting of the World Economic Forum? With topics such as climate regulations and greenwashing high on the agenda, it's clear that businesses need to be proactive in their sustainability work in order to navigate the challenges ahead. Can you please share with us your thoughts? What were the themes and the main takeaways from this year's event?
Well, first of all, I think what's important to note is that this was the first Davos that resumed in January. So because of the pandemic, Davos was halted for a few years. And last year they had a one-off that they actually hosted in May. So this was kind of the first return back to norm January Davos, where business leaders attended way more than before. So the numbers were quite high and the attendance was quite high as well. The theme for 2023 was cooperation in a fragmented world. I think leaders, whether it's business leaders, whether it's leaders in civil society, in different governments, they came together because they realized after the pandemic, a lot has changed and they need to tackle that. And a few key themes that stand out. I think the most important one, and the one that kind of shadowed last year Davos, and this year's Davos was specifically the ongoing war in Ukraine. The Russians' invasion of Ukraine has been dominating the Davos Forum for the last 2 years, and again, it still is one of the most pressing issues being discussed because of its implication also on global security, energy, and food production. So the cost of living crisis was probably, and the geopolitical issues were probably the most prevalent talked about themes at Davos this year. As a consequence of the ongoing living crisis, experts were talking about a global recession as a result of the geopolitical and economic tailwinds from the war in Ukraine, coupled with crippling inflation. As you correctly pointed out, the theme that also is recurring every year, but is picking up a lot of steam as well, is the climate crisis. WEF experts wrote in their Global Risks Report, which comes out every year, that a failure to mitigate climate change is still ranked as one of the most severe threats in the short term, but is also the global risk we are seeing to be the least prepared for. So again, climate change, a big topic at this year's forum, the process of decarbonization industries, the energy transition, investment in scaling up of new technologies, including more sustainable fuel sources, particularly talking about green hydrogen becoming a buzzword at this year's forum. So again, really big on climate action and climate change. The third was probably the growing food crisis. Food insecurity is largely interconnected with other global forums, key among them being climate crisis, the loss of biodiversity, extreme weather, the increasing number of natural disasters have all played their part in growing food shortages. And finally, I think a theme that we've been seeing every year, still picking up a lot of buzz, is the fourth industrial revolution.
Right. Technology, AI.
Right. Technology and innovation are always key themes at all discussions in Davos. But this year, particularly because people are talking, as you mentioned, about AI, quantum computing, bringing, how is it affecting governance with many crises? Also, can we unlock the potential of innovation to help solve the greatest challenges we're facing? So I'd say those are probably the four big themes that were pretty much highlighted at this year's annual meeting.
We know that this year's focus on climate change is a departure from previous downturns. Wouldn't you say that sustainability issues are taking the front seat as opposed to before, and compared to the economic priorities in the previous years? I know there were some fireside chats during the Davos summit, and that board governance was a subject also, how ESG needs to be incorporated into the strategy of corporations. It's always existed, especially since the early 2000s, and from before that it existed with 70s, where organizations used to use their platform to support the community. How do you think businesses can future-proof their companies with regards to ESG when putting their strategy together? How can they incorporate sustainability into their strategy to deliver long-term value?
There are a couple of steps, that organizations have considered when they're thinking about a clear ESG approach. And having a clear ESG vision and targets. And I think if I were to kind of structure those, how do you incorporate ESG in a business strategy? Well, the first thing that you would do is to understand what are the key material aspects that impact the business. Identify the key stakeholders and priorities among the different stakeholders. So you kind of understand the baseline performance on key ESG parameters. Second, you benchmark performance with your peers and industry leaders, where it helps you identify gaps and best practices. This is going to help the business identify a roadmap with short, medium, and long-term targets for all ESG parameters. And it's going to be able to help the business track performance and trends, right? And then start its reporting internal and externally on ESG. Third, you would work towards formulating your clear ESG vision, the goals, the roadmap, based on performance trends and opportunities. You would kind of develop an engagement strategy with specifics to communicate with relevant stakeholders, again, including modes and frequency of communication, disclose ESG performance in the public domain, and finally, you get to the implementation of your roadmap to integrate ESG into the core business, working with industry shapers, different partnerships, so you can propagate greater adoption of ESG and share best practices with one another.
Just before we end, Youmna, I want to go back to, with COP28 coming towards the end of the year, with the build-up towards the COP28, basically. I just want to ask you about the Paris Agreement. I know, Paris Agreement is always referenced whenever COP is mentioned. Can you just kind of explain the relationship between that big event that happened in Paris in 2015?
In 2015, the Paris Agreement at COP21, which succeeded the Kyoto Protocol, basically at COP21, the agreement kind of bound countries to declare nationally their determined contributions to basically tackle climate change. So it committed them to limiting global warming to no more than 2 degrees, or ideally no higher than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And what's interesting about that specific COP21 was that the UAE was the first Arab world nation to sign and ratify the Paris Agreement. So again, since Paris, and this is why Paris was so instrumental, there are both negotiated and non-negotiated outcomes at every COP. And the first relate to the text of the Paris Agreement itself. So I think this is why it was very, very important. And I think what's interesting to mention is that this year it will be another historic COP, not just because the UAE will be the first Gulf country to host it. I'm not going to say MENA because it was hosted at Sharm el-Sheikh last year, but it will also deliver the first global stocktake, or GST, of the nationally determined contributions made since Paris. So again, a lot to look forward to with this new COP. And finally, climate adaptation is at the center of every talk. And I think all the countries are really kind of realizing that the disastrous impacts of climate change are becoming more frequent and acute. And so, according to the most recent IPCC report, almost 3.3 billion people now live in highly vulnerable climate contexts. So leaders, government heads, civil society, again, academia, nobody can ignore what it means today or dismiss it at this point. Yes,
absolutely. Well, thank you, Youmna, for being with us. Thank you for your time. I know you have a busy day ahead of you. So thank you again for joining us today. And thank you for listening to us.